It's a real pleasure to introduce our guest speaker tonight, research ecologist Paul Hessburg. You might know Paul as the scientist behind the film Era of Megafires, or perhaps from his TED Talks, or maybe from one of his 136 peer-reviewed scientific research papers. Nobody has shaped my understanding of what our forests look like 300 years ago compared to today more than this gentleman here. Please welcome the president of the Association of Fire Ecology, professor at the University of British Columbia, Oregon State University, University of Washington, Washington State University, and U.S. Forest Service senior research ecologist at the Pacific Northwest Research Station, my guy, Paul Hessburg.
Probably not projecting as well as I can. It's a super privilege to be here with you. Mount Adams is one of my favorite districts. I spent 40 years in the Forest Service working with folks like Jim White, Tally, and timber cruising. For me, this is like coming back home. I've known a lot of rangers and fire staffs and officers of every kind, and you live in one of those beautiful places in the cosmos. Just a little bit about myself. I grew up in Minnesota. Studied forestry at the University of Minnesota. I grew up logging, and I spent 10 years cutting timber in the Lake States and building roads and such. Fought fire in the summertime, 5 summers. Got my share of smoke when fires weren't as severe as they are today. Raised 5 kids. They've all come up fighting fire to pay for their college education, including my daughters, and they all graduated with no debt. So let that be known that there's a way to get through college. Silas is here. He fought fire with my oldest daughter, Anne Marie, quite some time ago now. At any rate, I came out here as a young 20-year-old guy after forestry school and went to grad school at Oregon State. Studied forest pathogens and insects for my doctoral work, and then landscape ecology in my postdoctoral work. And what I was interested in really is how insects, pathogens, and wildfires make a living in forests. How do they move through forests as a process? And so I spent the last 40 years of my research career studying forest landscapes and how native forest pathogens, non-natives, insects, bark beetles, spruce bud worms, and wildfire as a process actually read a landscape and how they penetrate or are retarded by the conditions they find in the forest. And our laboratory in Wenatchee is kind of unique in this regard. We're looking at really big system-level dynamics. We're asking a question like, if the fires are so big and so hot today, what tipped large systems towards less stable dynamics? And so we build models of forest conditions, how they've changed, and then we burn them with wildfires and ask the question, what is causing the fire to be resisted? What allows for big patches of severe fire to happen, and so forth. And over the last 40 years, we've reconstructed almost 450 randomly selected watersheds, reconstructed them from the early to late 20th century, and asked the question, what changed? So my talk tonight is going to be a distillation for the Northwest primarily, because that's relevant to you, about what changed and why that matters to us. And I'm going to start with something that's going to scare the crap out of you, but I'm going to finish with something that really is wholesome. The forests of today look nothing like the forests our grandparents and our great-grandparents inherited. And I'll show you pictures of them. We've had this sort of changing baseline syndrome over the generations, and so people love what they love. They think this is naturalness and that sort of thing. But I'm going to show you some photos that actually show real places then and now and the changes that have happened. And they've actually changed processes like bark beetle outbreaks, how dwarf mistletoe and root disease work in the woods, and how wildfire works in the woods, okay? The hopeful note is we can actually create incredibly good transitions if we do the work to create the transitions. We can have forests around for the future. We can adapt these forests to climate change, okay? All right, I'm going to begin. We didn't break landscape resilience on purpose. And here I'm talking about public land managers. Our forestry comes over from Prussia and Germany, and stand management was the mode of the day. And so the people who brought forestry to this country taught us stand management. Remember how we were trained, Jim, in classical forestry training? We've had to unlearn all of it because they didn't teach us about how landscapes work. And that's what we've learned. It's kind of cool in the last 30 years. Big landscapes have functionality that looks nothing like what goes on at the stand level. So my story is about that today, okay? So we broke them, but we can get them back. And I'm going to show you what I mean by how we broke resilience and what are the key things that we can put back that are the hopeful message, right? All right, this is Fire Hall 101, so I'm going to see if this actually works. All right, at this particular view, you look at the western United States, and what you see is brown spots, the different colors of brown, and you see green spots. The green spots are sky islands, sometimes in Utah and Nevada, or they're big patches of forest. And you know why the forest lives there? Because that's where the snow lives, right? So forests get enough time-release water to be forest as a life form because it's the Goldilocks sweet spot where you get the right temperature, light, moisture, and nutrients, and you get time-release water. Well, under climate change, the snowpack is really changing. Where I live, up in eastern Washington there, close to Wenatchee, Washington, in the 21st century, our snow-dominated regime is shifting to a rain-dominated regime by 2100. That's serious stuff. And you stop and think about all the trees that make a living, the silver fir and the noble fir and the hemlock Doug fir zone. All of that stuff is going to be looking for environments to live in that are not the ones that they're on today. So the map of where stuff gets to grow is shifting as well, okay? So it looks great from this level, but when we beam in, we see some different stuff. These are the key change agents. Fire exclusion, we've now come to learn by working with indigenous partners all over the country. It actually starts with the loss of indigenous burning, which ended pretty significantly when the Euro-American diseases came to the Western United States. That came with trappers, traders, and gold rushers at the time. And so by the time 1900 happened, probably 85 to 90% of all the indigenous people were actually killed by disease. And so the United States was thought of as terra nullius, nobody lives here. And it's because those diseases had killed off most of the indigenous people. 10–15% remnant is what survived over time. So that's when it really starts. Then we wanted agriculture, we drained the wetlands, they used to be more numerous all across the country. Livestock grazing followed that, so we had ag, pasture. We developed the built environment. As soon as we have a built environment, nobody wants fire around it, so that's the first times when fire exclusion is associated with people and their sediments, and then fire suppression is actually just the last in the long series, I think. So I think of fire suppression as being something that, depending on where you are, is 120 to 170 years long. A lot of trees grow, and they grow pretty good size in that period of time, yeah? All right, timber harvest. When we built the West, we cut the big old trees because there was more wood per stick, and so we saw all the old growth go down the road. 90% of it was liquidated during that period of time. And smaller trees filled in, and everybody thought that that was advanced regeneration for the next forest. But very often, tree species we didn't want came back, and they came in thickly. They were shade tolerant, they came back in layers, and that's what started to feed the fire regime. We tended to kill off the hardwoods in favor of the conifers. Take you back in the Wayback Machine on the west side, red alder was super abundant, and the maples were super abundant on Western Cascades landscape after fire. You went through a generation of red alder before it was reinvaded by Douglas fir, the next pioneer species. So we didn't want red alder, so we got after it, right? All over the place in the West, we got rid of aspen, alder, bark beetles. Large bark beetle outbreaks today are responding to the overcrowded conditions that happened in the 100 years after the timber harvest happened. There are in many places 10 to 100 times more trees that are associated with the native fire regime. So bark beetles are essentially thinning in the absence of fire. Climate change is a big deal. It's warmer, drier, windier, and the fire seasons are getting longer. In a lot of places, they're 40 to 80 days longer, and we have some geographies that are year-round now. And so that's a lot of exposure to fire and conditions that make fuel available to burn. Human starts in the U.S. are now 85 to 89% of all the fire starts. That is so significant, it's actually changing the fire regime hugely. All right, and finally, smoke management. We're not willing to tolerate prescribed burning smoke because we're inundated by wildfire smoke. We're intolerant of it, and we see the air quality regulations tightening down, even though there's a negative feedback to wildfires. The less you prescribe burn, the bigger and the hotter the wildfires. So we're trying to get that sorted with prescribed burning and smoke management regulations. Huge public health consequences right now. They're 10 to 300 times a year the cost of fighting fires. So they're in the hundreds of billions of dollars at a continental scale. This is the change in area burned over the 11 western states. Here you can see the early part of the 20th century warm and dry climate, and those were the acres that were burned. We still don't have our ducks in a line. 10 AM rules about 1934, 1935, and we still weren't great at putting fires out. In the middle, it looked like we're amazing, but we actually got a quiescent period in the climate, and the climate made us look like we're powerful with fire suppression. About 50 years of fire suppression where we knocked almost everything out, and then the climate was no longer throwing us a bone. And so you start seeing, despite all of our best efforts in increasing the resources we're throwing at wildfires, acres burned steadily climbs. So we're at about an average of 7 million acres a year in the western United States. All right, and this is what's driving it, Pacific Decadal Oscillation. It's think of our climate, most of our climate comes off the ocean, 70% water, and so warming warms the oceans. In the Pacific Northwest, our climate comes off the Pacific Ocean and the Northern Pacific Basin. During an El Nino year, there's a phase of the Pacific Decadal Oscillation that pushes warm air up here, and that's what drives difficult fire seasons. We see such things as heat domes get parked, blocking ridges of high pressure, things like that, and they're going to be more and more frequent. All right, on to some of the changes. Can you see this okay? Okay, all of the black and whites on top are going to be 1930s vintage photos. This is looking at dry ponderosa pine and mixed conifer, dry mixed conifer forests, 1934 on top, 2010 on the bottom, and you can see south aspects and the ridges are the exposed areas that are staring out at us. Those were either sparse woodlands or treeless in those particular areas, and topography had strong spatial control on forest type and density. Fires were typically frequent, and frequent fire made for increasing the common frequent fire. So fires that look like this, occasionally like this. All right, so the cartoon is that frequent low or moderate severity fire creates conditions that actually are inviting of fuels, surface winds coming down, curing the fuels on the forest floor where you get ignitions. Those burns continue to burn. And so you end up seeing this condition not altogether identical, but it's repeating. The look of it, the condition of it is what's repeating. You take those fires out of the woods, and what you see is trees fill in like I described. They build fuel ladders that now the flames can climb up the sub-canopy of seedlings, saplings, poles like this, and now they're into the upper canopies of the trees. And the large trees that you see in the upper canopy were the trees that were around historically, and the ones that are underneath there are the ones that are filled in. Some of Keala Hagman's work shows that on the average within the ponderosa pine zone, somewhere between 5 to 30 or 40 trees per acre was common stocking in ponderosa pine forest with frequent fire. So in those forests, we have 50 to 100 times more trees on some of those acres, really overstocked. All right, this is in the moist mixed conifers, so think western larch, Douglas fir, lodgepole pine, early after fire, sometimes subalpine fir. It's Mount Rainier, you can see, in both of those. This is Natchez Ranger District country. And you can see that in the moist forests, more productive, less frequent fire. So every 25 to say 50 years, more fuel accumulated. So when you got fires, you actually got more moderate severity fire, more of this flavor and some of this flavor, creating patches on the landscape. And the patchwork held power itself. It was throttle control on whether fires could move across the landscape, whether there was fuel adjacent to an area, whether or not it could get up into the canopies of trees. So if you stop and think about it, having areas of non-forest, open canopy forest, young forest that hasn't recovered again, all of those things affect how fire can flow on the landscape and whether or not it can actually kill trees, get hot enough, big enough to kill trees. So there's power in this patchwork of the historical forest. That condition is much more stable in the long run than this condition is. you can actually store more forest in a patchwork that looks like that. Crazy, huh? So this is subalpine fir, Engelmann spruce, lodgepole pine forest. These are the higher elevations, but not the tippy top of the mountain yet, okay? And up on top there, it's a 120-degree panorama, and as far as the eye can see, you can see that there was so much fire in those upper elevations in the 1930s. Nobody's around today that remembers and can tell that story. But these landscapes weren't wall-to-wall forests like you see right here. The other thing that's really crazy about this is this landscape has a lot of hardwoods in it. So it's got aspen, willow, maples in it, that sort of thing, and those are governors on fire flow. Why? Hardwood forests have leaves that mat, and so they're difficult. It's not like needle litter on the ground. They're matted leaves, and you actually, when you get a fire, you only skiff off the top of that. So the duff and litter consumption is different over time, and they're moist. It moistens the environment so that when fires come there, the fires slow down, they drop from the tree canopies, and they try to get on the forest floor, and then they don't go through. That's probably 85% of the time during the fire season. So hardwoods are an important throttle control on fires. All right, this is tippy top of the mountain. This is close to 10,000 feet. This happens to be from the Blue Mountains. And here I'm showing you copse forest. So you know what a copse is? It's an island of trees, right? And trees that propagate as primary and secondary succession continue to unfold. The forest continues to grow at the end of the copse, making the tree island bigger. This is how these forests develop right here. Here's a zoom in today to show how that forest has changed. We've got plots in there, and there are well over 100 times more trees within these cold forests than used to be there. So this was meadow country. This was wet and dry meadow country, right? And this is where the elk would hang in the summertime, and they'd be tough to get down. All right, some key ideas here. We've been studying forest fire, but what we found out by studying wilderness areas, it's not just fire, it's forest reburning. It's fire on fire on fire on fire interactions that create the gorgeous complexity of landscapes, west side and east side. It's not just you occasionally get a fire and it changes things and it wakes up an early part of the life cycle of trees. It's essentially that you get a fire that happens and then another fire partially overlaps that one. And then over time, another fire partially overlaps parts of both of those fires. And what you get when you see those fires placed down on the landscape is great complexity in size, age, density, species composition, and that gives you the patchiness of the historical landscape. We've learned that by studying wilderness landscapes where we've allowed them to burn for 5 decades, and we go back in and we see this reburning phenomenon actually working. And it absolutely resonates with the fire frequency of those fire environments. So by forest type, the variability in fire frequency and return interval that we see comes out of a reburning ecology, not just fire. So the answer is not just getting fire back into the system, but invite an active fire regime back into the system. I'll concentrate on a few of those things in a minute. But one of the key things about that means that what you're trying to do is get fire in the forest, but you're trying to invite it so you can keep allowing lightning fire or prescribed burning fire back into the forest again. Because it's fire on fire interactions at a known frequency that actually allows that patchwork to develop of non-forest elements and forest elements, different age classes of forest, hardwoods, wetlands, all of that kind of stuff that are critical to landscape resilience, and that's what we broke. All the non-forest, that was on forest-capable ground, and so what we decided we'll do is say, we can grow trees there. We'll let trees encroach, and we'll manage trees there. We've lost most of our meadows. Working with Megan Halabisky from University of Washington, Mount Rainier, and she's showing that most of the meadows around Mount Rainier that were burned are being encroached by trees, even in those wet habitats. So a lot of changes happened, west side and east side. So fires overlapped, they created ever-shifting mosaics, they overlapped each other in space and in time. And so essentially, so many things were able to make a living at different scales because of this reburned complexity that was popping off over the landscape. Most fires were small to medium size, but most area was burned by the very big fires. So to think about it, if there was a 1,000,000-acre fire, a 100,000-acre fire was 10 times more common, And a 1,000-acre fire was 10 times more common than that. And a 100-acre fire was 10 times more common than that. And a 1-acre fire was 10 times more common than that. The frequency of events by size is a logarithmic fit. And so big events were actually fairly rare. When they happened, then reburning complexified those areas again, dappling it with small and medium-sized fires. That's how landscape worked. All right, the shifting, reburning, and recovering mosaic is what regulated future fire size and severity, and that's the missing ingredient on landscapes today. What's happening right now is wildfires are willy-nilly creating non-forest elements on the landscape. And essentially what they're doing is they're taking high potential energy areas and they're converting them to low potential energy areas. It's a big physics problem. The things that cause forests to obtain unproductive acres are the same things that drive the fire regime. So over space and time, there's this tug of war going on. I'm going to grow forest, I'm going to take some of it away. I'm going to grow forest, I'm going to take it away. And the emergent property of that tug of war is meadows, wetlands, hardwood forests, wet and dry meadows, and sparse woodlands that are, and the indigenous people would manage the understories of many of those places because the grocery store was in the understories. So they were opening up forest canopies so that the understories were highly productive. So cultural burning fed into that and actually made fires a little bit more frequent and living on the landscape much safer because they're constantly tending the grocery store. All right? So reburning is cool. Cultural burning added an awful lot to it. And if you stop and think about prescribed burning, we're not just talking about getting fire in the woods, we're talking about keeping fire in the woods at intervals. Okay, so that's the essential learning. Reburning, here's why it's powerful. The first fire kills stuff. It falls on the ground. The second fire consumes stuff. The third fire consumes even more. And then you have this period of grace, decades, when it's very difficult to burn the overstory canopy of the forest because reburning of low and moderate severity has been disposing of fuels from the fires. When we model this with some of our big landscape models, we find out that any one time there was 25 or 30% of the forest on the landscape that simply wasn't burnable because reburning made the dead wood on the forest floor unavailable to wildfire. It had been consumed. So essentially, it's taking the rakes and get rid of the dead wood on the forest floor. Okay, let's see. With reburning, the key thing is you can stock more forest. You simply can, and the hopeful message is if we recreate the patchwork, we're putting the governors back in that landscape. And a resilient landscape in the Cascade Mountains on the east side is about 42% not forest at any one time. It's in meadows, wet and dry meadows, woodlands, wetlands, savannas, grasslands, tall and short grasslands, on forest productive acres. We've reconstructed the late 20th century where forests are able to grow and where they weren't forested. And when we look at the early 20th century photos, most of the acres were productive forest acres that are now treed today. So non-forest was growing on productive forest acres. So resilient landscapes are less forested than we think. That has ramifications for how much biomass and how much carbon you can actually store under climate change and shifting wildfire regimes as well. All right, we're well over carrying capacity. Our carbon accounting is showing us that when we actually rebuild resilient landscapes, depending on the geography, it varies so much, that between 20 and 25% we're over carbon carrying capacity in forest stocks and sinks right now. So there's an effect of keeping fire out of the woods and not having fuel limited conditions on the landscape. So if you stop and think about it, there's an awful lot of problems that have to be solved about where to plant trees, how much carbon we can actually have under 21st century climate change, and then how to store it. All right, a couple of other things I want to show you. This has ramifications for wildfire, so I'm going to translate the structure of the forest into the flammability of the forest. On the top, those are historical conditions in a watershed. Bottom, 2020s, current conditions for forest structure, fuel loading, crown fire potential, flame length. How long a flame gets, the likelihood it gets into the upper tree crowns, how much dead wood on the ground. Dead wood on the ground drives fire into the canopies. You can basically see that the complexity of the structure in the upper landscape on the far left essentially drove how vulnerable the landscape was, and the changes in forest structure and their connectivity drove the connectivity of wildfire that you see in the bottom rack of conditions. Does that make sense? Hot colors, worse, cool colors, more better? All right, so essentially we created surface and canopy fuels at a patch level, and we did it to neighboring patches, so there's high connectivity of that condition. And the worst part of it is there's high connectivity at continental scale. This is a 150 million acre interior Columbia Basin landscape, a landscape that was historically dominated by low and moderate severity fire in the top photo. Low is yellow, moderate's orange, red is high severity, and you can see how moderate and high now dominate in the early 21st century landscape. All right, non-forest conditions, just want to say a word about them. Most of them happen on forest-capable sites. In our reconstructions at province levels, we're seeing between 25 and 75% of any province was in non-forest conditions. Southern Cascades, about 25% only was in non-forests. Blue Mountains, 50-50. Northern Rockies, Glaciated Mountains, Okanagan Highlands, about 60% forest, 40% non-forest. And this is a typical photo that you would see of what a forest living well with its fire regime would look like. So it can support trees wall to wall, but it can't with the fire regime it's going to be frequently visited by. So the question is, how do you invite fire back and have a forest that can live in harmony with the fire that's coming back? And the message is that that's not a negotiable thing. Fire is coming back, and so the question is, can you invite it back peacefully, tend it, allow lightning conditions to go, watch them on many occasions, steer them, hold them, release them, that sort of thing. That's going to be the necessity. This is in the Bob Marshall Wilderness, where we have large areas that are now back in fire regime, hundreds of thousands of acres where we've allowed fires to burn for 50 years. So what we're seeing in many provinces, 40 to 50% of the area was in these non-forest elements at any one time, and they end up being incredibly important to many of the nesting, roosting, foraging, breeding kind of habitat configurations that species that have low and moderate mobility have on the landscape as well. So it's not just about the landscape ecology of fire, it's also about habitat ecology as well. Let's see, non-forests are rock, snow, ice. They can't become forested, so they're always permanent. But then they're burned bare ground. They're very new forests that have basically mostly grass and shrubs. They're sparsely treed savannas, wet and dry meadows, prairies, tall and short grass, shrublands, wetlands. And these features are part of the secret sauce of resilient forest landscapes. They're intermixed across the landscape, and they're part of how fires end up having to halt. We've been monitoring fuel moistures in wet and dry meadows in areas where there are fires. And one of the things that we're noticing, when relative humidity is recovering, these meadow areas, they recover their fuel moistures. And so fires will actually go to die in a meadow whose fuel moisture has recovered. So they're not only burnable by day, but when relative humidity recovers, they actually stop fire by night. Now that we're having RH not recovering, we're seeing a reversal of that fortune. So that tug of war I talked to you about, non-forest, hardwoods, wetlands, those were the emergent property of that tug of war between factors growing forests, factors taking them away. And so a good way to think about it is if you think of a large forest landscape that needs to live with wildfire, it essentially has to have patchwork conditions, canopy cover, species composition conditions that are in the neighborhood of those things that actually govern the active fire regime. And if they're not, the fire regime will recalibrate that. So there's essentially a tipping point, and we're finding out what the tipping point is where more benign landscapes start to kick in again. It doesn't look anything like our current landscapes. All right. I'm going to skip over that. So this one is just showing you that there's 3 levels of stabilizing effects: at the patch scale, at the patchwork scale, and then across really big, broad life form landscapes. And patch size distributions drive most of the fires are small like this, but most of the area is actually burned in the gray in the largest fires. So it's fires of all patch sizes and severities that are critical to maintaining that landscape. It drives insect regimes. Native bark beetle, this happens to be mountain pine beetle. Here's its range in British Columbia, a little bit of Alberta, western United States. And you can see that it was a native in this landscape. It was isolated because it couldn't run coast to coast. Landscape changes. Now we have really big outbreaks that look like that. And so we're seeing a native insect now in a non-native role. All of our bark beetles, for the most part, are in a non-native role. All right, climate warming. We've heard it's getting hotter and drier and windier. Some super cool indigenous work going on that's basically telling us that you'll read a lot of articles that basically say that the climate drives area burned across the landscape, right? What we're finding out is in indigenous time, that was not the case. There was so much indigenous burning on the landscape. Here's some cool animated drawings. Are these cool or what? My drawings are burning. Have you ever seen that before? No. So that's an example in the top of indigenous burning, where someplace across the landscape they were burning patches, they were cultivating bare grass, they were refreshing huckleberry fields at the higher elevations, doing an awful lot of things, burning, whoops, I do that. So, and then in the middle, we're starting to put fires out again, and if it was a little, can you see that the forest is getting denser in the middle one? So there's a lot of hardwoods in the top one, it's more open, patchy, and you can see it's getting denser. You can see we're dropping firefighters in, and that sort of thing, it's denser. And now you can see under the suppression episode, it's dense, and now we have fires that escape initial attack. Truth of the matter is the worst 2 or 3% of fires are burning most of the landscape. And the really good ones that are small, that are easy to hook, are actually fires that could do some great work for us. All right, for further reading, you have a copy of my, Sarah, you'll have a copy of my PowerPoint, but there's some really cool papers that are talking about this in the Sierra Nevadas, this is the American Southwest, a bunch of areas where they've tied together centuries of work through the tree rings that basically show that the area burn signal was not climate driven during the indigenous period, which is super cool. All right, that's one of the pieces there. It's Taylor et al. From the Sierra Nevada. On to climate change, this is what we're talking about. This is the global average temperature compared with the mid-20th century right here. And this is what's driving what we're seeing right now. It's anthropogenic warming, whether we love to talk about that or not. It's related to our greenhouse gas emissions, and this is what it means for our future. You can see that winters are still, so cool colors cold for average daytime high temperatures, and hot colors hot, right? But look what's happening to the shoulder seasons. April and October temperatures, we're basically seeing very significant changes that are happening to the seasonality of climate zones across the United States. So the summer's not just getting hotter, but the spring and fall seasons are changing significantly, has huge ramifications for humans living and for forests. And this is what it means in a nutshell. By 2100, the northern hemisphere will experience about half of the year will be in summer, and that's pinching out spring and fall, and it's shortening winter like you can see here. That means the period of snowpack and the period of rainfall is going to change significantly, and we're going to see quite a bit of shifting. Bark beetle outbreaks are going to be on the rise in the 21st century, and the time-release water that forests need. Imagine what the silver fir zone and the noble fir zone get, and the Doug fir hemlock zone and Doug fir red cedar zone, right? How much moisture they get. That's shifting. And it's shifting because of this phenomenon. All right, so take-homes. Current interior landscapes, the biomass isn't sustainable, and we can create some transitions, or wildfires can create them. What we're seeing in our models is that the wildfires, we've downscaled the climate for the 21st century. And we've run it annually all the way up to 2100. We've done that hundreds of times to see whether or not we can see anything that's out of the normal that will come out of the simulations. And what it basically says, within the next 20 years, the wildfires that have burned by 2040, 2045 will have already changed the landscape to an extent that now the fires that have burned drive the bus. So the area burned, and you're seeing it now, Cougar Fire, right? The burn scar is burning with Williams Mine right now. We're seeing a lot of reburn events because the trees fall down, they reburn, grass shrubs obtain, an ignition gets somewhere on that perimeter and it keeps sending it. So we see fire dynamics now influenced by this very coarse-grained, really big patch landscape that occurs rather than the small and medium-sized patchiness. So that's the big concern, is that the time frame for doing the work is short, but it's actually long enough to do a lot, to put forests in decent condition. So we need to reestablish those burned and recovering mosaics. We've got some pretty good data to use to align to basically say what they look like. We wrote a paper on how to use topography to realign forest edge conditions back to topography. Ridges, valleys, north and south aspects, that sort of thing, because that's the way we saw the alignment historically. All right, we need to stabilize that tug of war. Fires are going to do it. What we need to do is create transition that allow fire to come back in without taking the forest. And that means we need to allow some trailing edge forests to become meadows again. We need some dry forests to become sparse woodlands again that have become treed. We literally need to adapt all of those ingredients back out onto the landscape again, because that's throttle control for flame length, fire line intensity, and crown fire potential. We need more open canopy forests. We're finding out in all of our climate change simulations, if you just create significant areas with open canopy forest in the dry and the moist mixed conifer, you change the fire regime and you keep forest. So that's really, really critical. Closed canopy forest is a German-Prussian kind of thing on public lands. It's not going to work with the fire regime that's coming back to those forest types. So we have to rethink that. Okay, restore the positive ecological role of fire. We're working with our indigenous partners right now. We want to be able to have conditions where the cultural resources that they're interested in are also available in those understories. It's completely consistent with the fire regimes we want to restore in those conditions. Open canopy conditions produce the grocery store that they're interested in those areas. All right, primary tools are cultural burning, prescribed burning, managed wildfires, and thinning and prescribed burning when needed. And in many cases, locally, we may have some thinning and biomass removal that we can take to biochar or gasification and that kind of thing. But it's not a huge deal. With climate change, the inescapable thing we're seeing is that more non-forest elements emerge than occurred historically, and more open canopy forest conditions. And that is if we cooperate with the fire regimes as they're shifting, and if we cooperate with how the climate is warming and drying. So it's essentially trying to transition to the conditions that will return, that will come as a consequence of warming and drying, rather than having wildfires create transitions where many times forests will not reobtain after a severe fire. Think about it, how many big fires that you've been on, when you can see 10 years later, 15 years later, there's not a single conifer growing in that 10,000 acre patch. It's very, very difficult to become a tree there. It's so hot and dry. So avoiding those huge, constant large fires is the critical thing. Doesn't mean that large fires is bad. Historically, we're finding out they were common as dirt. Large fires, 1 million, 2, 3 million acre fires, up to 10 million acre fires happened in the western United States. The difference was they were incredibly, splendidly varied with low, moderate, and high severity patches burning through meadows and things like that. So big isn't bad, it's the fire severity patterns inside of those events that's really worrisome. All right, the annual treatment footprint needs to actually exceed the work of wildfire each year for each decade in order for wildfire not to do most of the work. Does that make sense? So if wildfires are burning 7 million acres and we're moving towards 10 million acres a year on average in the next decade, our work together in the 11 western states, for example, has to exceed that footprint. Otherwise, we will not overtake the work of wildfire. Okay? I just wanted to end with what I think are some pretty cool photos that came out of the bootleg fire. We read about just how much area burned in 2021 with the 400-acre Oregon bootleg fire, right? Over here on the left, you can see how running crown fire within a few rows of trees just literally dropped to the ground in a thinned and burned area. And it continued to burn right across that into an area that hadn't been thinned and burned, recrowned again. Punchline slide. I firehoused it up. All right. On the left side there, you can see the fire. You can see the fire moving into an area that was just thin, but they didn't get the prescribed burning. They got some of the piles burned, but they didn't get the broadcast burning done. And so you can see it actually took an awful lot of trees from a beautifully thin stand. As soon as it crossed the road here, they didn't stop it. It burned all the way through the thinned and prescribed burn stand. And it burned for something like 140 acres and on the floor, taking just a few trees on the way. Huge fire tornadoes on this side, by the way, just huge fire tornadoes whipping around, lifting up trees out of the ground. And it stopped on the other side in an area by a sylvan meadow, and then in another area it walked around, and then it just kept going on in a big dense forest again. So these areas work under extreme fire behavior too. A lot of Susan Pritchard's work from UW shows that if you do the right work, you treat the fuels on the ground, you get the effects that you want on the ground. I think that's my last slide. It is. Appreciate your kind attention. That's how I think landscapes work. That's what I've learned, and I think those are some of the ingredients that we need to put back on the landscape. Thank you very much for your attention.